helping people cope with and overcome life's challenges. This is Life Transformations with Michael Hart, Canadian certified counselor and award-winning psychotherapist.
Welcome to the Life Transformation Show. I'm your co-host, Denise Hart, and today we will continue our topic on Grief Uncovered, how to heal from deep loss, where we use the biblical story of King David's profound grief over the loss of his son. And this is found in 2 Samuel chapter 12. So to recap, for those who missed last week's show, last week we answered the following questions. Number 1, how David was able to bounce back so quickly from the death of his son. And we identified principles behind David's resilience that you can also apply to your circumstance. Secondly, how we can differentiate between healthy grieving and unhealthy grieving. Thirdly, how can someone prepare emotionally when they know that death is imminent? And fourthly, how do we cope with sudden and unexpected deaths? So if you missed last week's show, you can find it on Elim Counseling Services YouTube channel along with our latest contents. If you would like to get some help with your grief, please contact us at elimcounselingministry.com or by calling 613-699-1677 or 1-877-204-2914. Joining me in studio today is psychotherapist Michael Hart, who will continue to explore this topic. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much, Denise. I'm really glad to be here for part 2 of this very important conversation on grief. You see, grief is something that we will all face, yet it is often one of the most challenging experiences for us to go through. When we lose someone close, the emotions can be overwhelming, and many of us don't know how to process that grief in a healthy way. What's even more, what we find also is that people struggle to know how to respond to others who are grieving. They want to help, but are unsure of what to say or do. So that's why I'm excited to continue this conversation today, because understanding how to heal from deep loss and how to support those around us can make such a big difference.
That's so true, Michael. This is really a hard topic. So let's continue. I wanted to ask you, David's healthy coping after the loss of his son, as he rose from mourning and worshipped God, illustrates the potential for healing and moving forward. However, what are the signs of unhealthy grieving, and how can we understand the principle of this complicated grief and its causes?
Yeah, so when it comes to understanding what's healthy versus unhealthy, it can be very confusing, because sometimes we may see a client who come in for counseling and their partner died a week ago and they claim that they're already over the death. They're happy. They're not grieving. And as much as some people may see that as being spiritual and resilient, we would see that as a sign of unhealthy grieving, because grief is a difficult thing to go through. And we see that when Lazarus died, Jesus wept. And so Jesus didn't spiritualize it and just pretend, oh, everything is okay, it's not sad. Jesus actually wept. So there are healthy ways to go through grieving. So that's one way in which unhealthy grieving manifests itself. But another way in which it manifests itself is when we see someone who has a persistent preoccupation with the grief, with the person who has died. And yes, it is okay to be preoccupied with thoughts about the deceased loved one. But as we touched on last week, there are periods that in which it is healthy and periods after which it can become unhealthy. So, for example, in the immediate aftermath of a loss, it is typical for individuals to be intensely preoccupied with thoughts of the deceased. So this can include such things as sadness, anger, confusion, and frequent memories and reminders of the loved one. So we call that the initial phase. That's a 0 to 3 months phase of grieving. And then we get in the second stage, which is the adjustment phase. And that's from 3 to 6 months. And this phase is characterized by deep sadness, where the person at time has emotional reaction. But during this period, individuals may still have vivid memories and emotional reaction, but may also start to engage more with their surroundings and daily responsibilities. So whereas during the first 3 months, they may have withdrawn, they may have taken time from work, within that 3 to 6 months period, most people start getting back into their daily duties and start adjusting to life. This is not to say that they're over the death of their loved ones, but there is some sense of normalcy that is beginning to emerge. And then we get to the third phase of grief, which is the longer term phase, 6 to 12 months. So after 6 months, it is typical for thoughts about the deceased to become less intrusive and more integrated into one's daily life. What I mean by this is you will still have thoughts about your deceased loved ones, but it's not flooding your mind as before, where when the person just died, where you're waking up from your sleep, you can't sleep, you're having dreams of the deceased loved ones, everything that you do is affected by the memory of the loved one. In this longer term phase, you still have memories, but they are more integrated, meaning that they come from time to time and it does not disrupt your life as it did before. So while you may still remember the deceased loved one, what we find is that the feelings become less intense, allowing for more moments of joy and engagement in other activities. So whereas in the first 0 to 3 months, that initial phase, a person may find it difficult to laugh and to enjoy life, or may feel guilty if they find themselves laughing. When we get to the longer term phase, the 6 to 12 month phase, people are beginning to be able to enjoy life, to have fun, but they still have moments of sadness. They still have moments where they cry, but these periods are not as intense and are not as frequent as before.
So, Michael, there are other signs of unhealthy grieving. Did you want to explore some more of those?
Yes. But just let me say too that when it gets beyond the 12 months phase, where people still start having intense reaction, they're still having intense reaction. They find that they cannot sleep, they're not eating, they cannot go to work, and it's 12 months, then we would say that grieving has become unhealthy. And there may be the need for professional help to navigate around what's causing this unhealthy grieving. So another symptom of unhealthy grieving is when a person start expressing intense anger or guilt. So while some anger and guilt are normal parts of grieving, in what we call complicated grieving, when grieving goes awry, these feelings can become overwhelming and pervasive. So individuals may blame themselves unnecessarily. Maybe if I had a better way of preparing food, the person would not have died of cancer. Maybe if I had better eating habits, if I had integrated better eating habits in our family, the person would still be alive. And this kind of blaming of oneself is unhealthy. But in essence, what the person is trying to do is to look for ways and reasons to explain what has happened and trying to look for ways that it could have been prevented. So unfounded guilt is often found in complicated grieving. Sometimes people may feel that they caused an accident when in fact they had nothing to do with the accident. Maybe if I didn't buy that car for my child, the child would still be alive. Maybe if I didn't subsidize the buying of the car, the person would still be alive. Maybe if I didn't teach a person to drive, they would still be alive. And these are all unhealthy ways of processing the death of a loved one. So unhealthy grieving and anger is often a sign of unhealthy grieving. And anger can be towards oneself. Anger can sometimes be, this may be surprising to some of my listeners, but anger can sometimes be towards the deceased loved one, where a person may feel that they may have the sense that they were abandoned. Why did the person have to go at this time? And rationally, the person may know that this is not the case, but this feeling of abandonment can sometimes be triggered by death. Or anger could be as a result of feeling that this person could still be alive if they took better care of themselves, if they followed doctor's orders, or if they had taken the operation that was recommended or the cancer treatment that was recommended. These feelings of guilt and anger can result in what we call complicated grief. In other words, grief that has become so prolonged and hard to get over that it's affecting other areas of the person's life. So we talk about intense emotion, but that's not the only sign of unhealthy grieving. We also find that in this phrase, a person can develop physical symptoms as well. So physical symptoms can include fatigue, insomnia, changes in appetite, or unexplained aches and pains. And this can indicate emotional distress is being expressed through this physical discomfort. And again, while it's healthy to have some of these, it's a normal part of grieving to have some of these during the initial phase, the 0 to 3 months. If you have now entered the beyond the 12-month phase and you are still having these symptoms, you may have entered into what we call complicated grieving.
So I like what you said, Michael. It's okay to grieve in a healthy way. And so you spoke about complicated grief. Can you tell us what are some of the causes of complicated grief?
Complicated grief occurs sometimes when there are other emotions competing with the grieving process. So, for example, if someone have passed away, it's normal, I should say, to have feelings of sadness. But if you discovered after the person passed away that they were also having an affair that you didn't know about, then you could also have feelings of anger competing with your other emotions of sadness. So instead of just grieving the person's death, now you're also angry with that person. And this anger can get in the way of healthy grieving. And so the grieving process can be drawn out for a much longer period because of the anger that's mixed in with the sadness. And so when there are competing emotions, it's very hard to go through the grieving stages in a healthy way.
Michael will be right back. You have been listening to the Life Transformation Show, where award-winning psychotherapist Michael Hart of Elim Counseling Services has been using the scripture from 2 Samuel 12 to speak on the topic Grief Uncovered, How to Heal from Deep Loss, Part 2. You can find out more about us at elimcounselingministry.com or by calling 1-877-204-2914 or 613-699-1677. where you can also make a donation to this Christ-centered ministry. Your donations help us to stay on the air and to provide subsidized counseling to those who can't afford it. Back to Michael.
Another thing that can get in the way of grieving and can lead to complicated grieving is when there are extenuating circumstances that are affecting a person's ability to grieve the death of a loved one. So, for example, if the person has just died, but you are now plunged into financial hardship where you have to be thinking about your own survival, you can delay the grieving process because your energy is more focused on surviving. And especially if you're in a situation where you're left with young children, your preoccupation could be with, how am I going to provide for these children now that my husband is not around? And so this preoccupation with looking after the children can get in the way of you grieving in a healthy way. So this can result in complicated grieving. And what we find in complicated grieving is that sometimes 6 years after, or even 10 years after the person has died, these individuals who have had complicated grieving can still have intense outpour of emotions that's triggered by simple things, like maybe the breakup of a relationship, a breakup of a new relationship that's just a few weeks old. They can respond in a way as if they have lost a loved one. And why this is happening is that they have not really dealt with the death of their loved one. And so the breakup of a new relationship is triggering this deep sense of loss. And so another thing that can get in the way of grieving is if you have a series of losses in succession. So if you have suffered 2 or more losses in a short period of time, the ability to grieve each one in a normal, healthy way can be compromised, and you can become overwhelmed and stuck in the grieving process because of the accumulation of losses. So if you are grieving and you're going through any one of these circumstances that I have mentioned, it's important for you to get professional help, because complicated grieving can be very hard on a person's emotion and very hard on their physical body as well. And so there can be health complications that can develop as a result of complicated grief.
Great points again, Michael. So recognizing the signs of unhealthy grieving is very, very crucial, you're saying, so that our listeners can see if they can identify when someone may be experiencing complicated grief. And if they understand the causes, then they can get some help from a professional. So Michael, let's go back to David. So David, he just eventually rose up from his mourning and start worshiping God. What can we learn from this about moving forward after experiencing profound loss?
That's a very good question, Denise, and I'll be happy to address that. Let me say that David's response to the death of his son, as you mentioned in 2 Samuel chapter 12, and I think that's specifically verse 20, where he rises, he washes his face, and he worshiped God. And when he did those actions, I think these actions provide profound insight into the process of healing after experiencing significant loss. So here are several lessons that we can glean from the biblical account. And these insights that I'm about to share is also supported by psychological literature. So what we can read from David's reaction to his son's death is that there was a sense of acceptance that his son has passed away, acceptance of entering into the grieving process. So David's act of rising from mourning signifies a critical step in the grieving process. And this is acceptance. Before that, David was praying for his son to be healed. But once his son died, he got up, he washed himself, and he started worshiping. This is saying, even though this is hard, even though this is an unbearable loss, I am accepting the fact that this has happened. And while it hurts and is mourning deeply, his action shows a sense of acceptance. So acceptance is often recognized in psychological literature as a key component of healing. According to Kubler-Ross, model of acceptance is the final stage of grief where the individual begins to find peace with the loss. But the initial stage of that 5-stage process of grief is the stage that's called denial. And a lot of us, when we have sudden loss of a loved one, we go into this stage of denial, as if we behave as if it hasn't happened. We fail to come to terms with the fact that the person is no longer there. But David's action shows that there was an acceptance, and even the words to his servant, where he says, "Now that the child is dead," is a way of saying, I am accepting that the child is gone. And it's not unusual for people who have suffered loss to enter into this stage of denial where they hold on to fantasies such as the person is not really gone and this must be a dream. And somehow, even though they know cognitively the person is gone, there is not this deep sense of acceptance. But another important principle that we find from David's experience is the importance of rituals. So David's act of worshiping signifies the importance of rituals in the grieving process. And so engaging in spiritual practices, whether through prayer, worship, or community gatherings, can provide comfort and a sense of connection to something greater than one's self. So psychological studies have shown that rituals can help the individuals find meaning in their grief and facilitate healing by creating a sense of structure during a chaotic time. So if you have suffered the loss of a loved one, the funeral service is a ritual. And the service itself, the prayers, the singing, can be a way of finding closure. And I think there is a movement in our society to move away from these rituals because people want to make death this happy thing, this celebration, and it's not. And I think it's unhealthy to try to package death in a way that it's a happy thing, because it's a sad thing when someone passes away. As I said before, Jesus wept. And having a ceremony where family members and friends come together and they weep together and they mourn and they laugh together, it's a healthy way of going through the grieving process. So we see that David had this ritual that included worshiping his God after his son died. Another thing we can take from David's story is the importance of seeking community support. Although not explicitly stated in the story, the role of community in the grieving process is implied. David had others there. His servants were there. He was engaging with his servants after the death of his son. And I think this is very healthy, because the tendency that a lot of us have when we go through sad times or hard times, such as grieving and mourning, is to isolate ourselves from community, isolate ourselves for others. And while there may be a time for that, if you need a few days initially to be alone and to come to terms with what has happened, it's unhealthy to go through the phases of grief all by yourself. So David demonstrates to us that it's healthy to engage with community when there is a death.
Very good, Michael. I also notice that David worship, it illustrates his faith. You know, faith can be a source of strength during grief. You know, the Bible talks about the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. So this assures individuals that they are not alone in their grief and that divine support is available.
That is such a very good point, Denise. Finding strength in faith is an important principle in going through the grieving process. And David did that. David worshipped his God. So leaning on one's faith provides hope and resilience and helps us to find comfort.
So, Michael, we're quickly running out of time. I have one more question to ask. What are some do's and don'ts for people helping the bereaved?
One of the don'ts, let me begin with the don't. One of the don't is that we should not spiritualize the death of the deceased. David said the child is dead. But what I find often in Christian circles is that people will tend to say things right after the death of a loved one, things like, don't worry, they're in heaven, or heaven must be missing an angel. That's why God took your child home. These platitudes, these spiritual platitudes are very dangerous. They do not bring comfort. If anything, they can make the person angry with God. Why did God have to take my child because heaven needed an angel? Why did I have to suffer this? So we should refrain from speaking about the person being in heaven right away or heaven needed an angel, and don't spiritualize it to make the person who is suffering feel as if their faith is not strong enough because they're weeping and they're mourning. Sometimes we will quote scriptures like, in everything give thanks, or the joy of the Lord is my strength, as a way of telling people that they should have strength in the time of grieving and not be mourning. But this is very psychologically damaging and very dangerous. We should allow people to grieve. We should allow them to cry. Jesus himself wept when his friend Lazarus died.
So, Michael, I know you have more to say on this topic, and we'll definitely do a part 3. We'll be doing that in 2 weeks. That's because next week is Thanksgiving. So our topic for next week will be the importance of Thanksgiving. If you missed any part of today's show, Grief Uncovered, How to Heal from Deep Loss, you can revisit it and past episodes on Elim Counseling Services YouTube channel. Just search for Elim Counseling and subscribe to stay updated on all our latest content. You can find out more about us at elimcounselingministry.com. Please consider making a donation to help our Christ-centered ministry. Your contribution will directly help those seeking support and guidance. Until next time, this is your co-host, Denise Hart.
And Michael Hart, praying that God would bless you in all your relationships and keep you sound in mind and pure in heart.